There seems to be a question about the war between determinism and free will, and it's interesting to listen to the people on YouTube talk about it, because on one hand you have inmendham, Gary, who talks about determinism as a matter of fact, and on the other hand, you don't get a denial of cause and effect from Anton, but you do get information theory, and the idea of information being a moment, one's intersection with information or use of information is a moment that makes that which is causal but indeterminable. And so it appears that at a particular moment when one is thinking or using language to diagnose cause and effect, that one would find from other people's vantage points the idea of trying to use quantum information to justify kind of a randomness in the universe that is found within information theory that would allow behavior to be willed from the individual, that choice is willed from the individual, so to speak. And I guess I'll get into that in just a little bit. But so thinking about cause and effect, thinking about stochastic. It's funny to listen to Gary say stochastic instead of stochastic. But so if one throws an airplane in the air, and it's always moving downward in its flight, if one took a series of snapshots of the plane on its course, you would say that you could not determine where that plane was going to land. You know, pretty good thrust outside, let's say, very light breeze. You could not determine where that plane would land, but at every given point, the domain of possible landing places would narrow, and as you continued to snapshot through its flight, that domain would become more and more clear, or the domain would become smaller as to where the plane might possibly land. And this seems to be a domain of the stochastic, trying to find it's not a non or a causal event throwing the airplane, but being able to randomly find or determine where that plane is going to land almost seems impossible unless you're right there, just throwing it right at the ground, an inch from the ground. Then you pretty much know where it's going to land. And even then, on an atomic level, you don't analyze where it's landing and what it means to land in the place that it's landing, right? And so as the domain narrows, even in finance, as a stock reaches a certain time, trading time, or a certain limit at the end of the day, you can tell by the boundaries of a stock where that stock is more likely to land, even though it's not absolutely precise. Okay, so what I'm thinking about is the idea of that which is determinable butting up against that which is determinism, right? Because in one camp you'll say determinism is all and everything that is in the universe. I mean, we're affected by the gravity of all the stars in the universe. We're affected, because we're affected by all the gravity in the stars in the universe, one could say we're caused. Certain events that we have are caused by certain gravitational forces from every other body in the universe. But we want to narrow the domain. Like if a guy is shot in the chest and he dies, one might say, well, we know the cause of that. It was the gunshot, right? So immediately there's a logos that surrounds or is centrific to the cause of that person dying, where we say, oh, it's the gunpowder in the bullet firing and the bullet coming out and hitting the guy in the chest and the guy falls down. But one might eventually say that's the cause, but then a crime scene investigator after the fact might come back and look at that crime scene and say, well, he actually didn't die of the gunshot wound. He died when his head hit the ground, and it was that force that caused it. Or in addition to that, it might have been he didn't fall down because of the gunshot, or say, oh yeah, the bullet is what caused him to fall down and hit his head, when further investigation might indicate, well, he was already tripping, he was already mid-fall, and he had been drinking that night. He was stumbling, and midway down he fell down and bumped his head, and it was the head that killed him. And so it kind of changes the mode or the domain from which you would say that the individual died because of the gunshot wound. And so it's kind of a revisal of history, but it's also a revisal of the domain, the logical domain, that whatever the snapshot was initially saying it was the gun is revised to a whole different story, where he may have fallen down because he was drunk and hit his head, and the gunshot wound was simply incidental. So this idea that cause is always known, right, or that it can always be narrowed, is in one way an attachment to a certain form of determinism dogma. It's stating that one knows what it is that caused a certain event to happen, right? Because we have a language that allows us to create a history and a narrative, right? But narrative revisals are possible. Okay, so further thoughts on this are that because there's a domain of certainty that seems to come about when one speaks of what caused a man to die, or degree of certainty narrows as the plane gets closer to the end of its path. We speak about that narrative domain in a determinable fashion, and that's kind of an interiority to whatever it is we're looking at as an item reaches its limit or a measured marker. And the exteriority of that would be where determinism is. It would be where all gravities affect an event, right? And so if on one hand one wants to look at determinism and say, well, look, we might not be able to say what it was or that it was, but nevertheless the person died, he came to his limit, or the plane finally landed, it came to its limit. That's simply determinism fulfilling its course to say, oh, well, we'll all die, we'll all eventually reach our limit, right? And then it's caused by being alive and having our life come to its end, right? Of all things in the universe, of all gravities in the universe, of all causal forces, or just to say forces, and we almost can remove the word causal forces because the domain of trying to clarify what caused the end to occur, or where the plane lands when it's landing, because there is this notion that the plane is not going to continue flying and that we're not going to continue living. We can state, or like the old mystic said, you know, the sun will go supernova. Well, he didn't say that, but the sun will go supernova in a matter of its cosmic history coming to fruition or coming to completion, and that will basically engulf the earth. So wherever we're at, the earth will come to its end eventually, right? And that we're a part of this, and that this started whenever we claim we know the universe started. On the other hand, when you think about symbolism and information theory, and you think about how language itself allows us to lay down the determinable causes, or to claim that we know what the determinable causes are of any particular event, that the limit of the language creating that boundary or that domain rubs up against determinism. The interiority, the determinable, rubs up against the exteriority, or the determinism. And that a revision, in the case of the man dying, initially thinking it's the gunshot, and then it turns out that he's drunk, is a revision, but it's also where that which is determinable collapses in or collapses out against that which we would say was known as a cause, that we know this is a cause. So the very idea that one can speak of cause, the mere fact that we are symbolic creatures, that humans are symbolic creatures, using, well, in our language, even go over the idea, well, the pyrhho are not ahistoric or socio-historic beings in the same manner that we are, yet they're still human. But our language allows us to speak and create these causal domains, and these determinable domains, or these indeterminable domains. And so because of that, when one thinks about energy in terms of information, energy as information, and the way in which we border cause and effect in our dialogue, whether or not it's talking about quantum mechanics and wave functions or particle functions, particle processes or wave functions, there's a rub going on there, because we're limited to the stacking and the butting up against and the linear next to process, that one word coming after another contains a linear boundary, right? But in symbolism, you have pictures that have lines within them. You have borders that you can look at. You have colors, and you have things that represent fonts. You have things that represent imagery that has a symbol that takes on another meaning, that one would say, oh, well, these are subjective events of the language, but the objective description is an authoritarianism. So in one way, and perhaps I'm erratic in saying this, but in one way, whatever we use to lay down symbolically a line of cause, a limit of saying this is what caused this is what determined this, and then blame and then say that everything came from this historic causal movement, this deterministic cause, is nevertheless still a part of our being able to say it, which doesn't mean it's not without its possibility of revision. That if you think of a memory in your past of, let's say, your father in some location, and then you still frame that image in your mind, and you think about a smell, you apply a smell to it, or you take an aspect of the image, a certain color, and emphasize that in your mind, you can revise your own history of what an event, what was taking place in an event, or even what somebody else's motives or intent might be within an event. So you get Anton, right, speaking about motion and action, and that a kiss on a stage is a kiss, but it doesn't mean the same thing as a kiss, right? It's like, it's not a real kiss, it's a play act kiss. But maybe the actor, if you sympathize with the actor, yeah, she went through the motions of having the kiss, and it was a kiss, but let's say she actually loves that actor that she's with, right? And so if she actually loves that actor that she's with, even though she knows he's acting, it means more to her. But to an audience member, they may have that rub or make that distinction between, hey, this is just a play, so that kiss means nothing to those actors on stage, right? But in fact, a revisionist history might allow us to investigate the intent behind one of the actors, or behind both the actors, to find out that that very movement, that very action in retrospect allowed a deeper emotional relationship to that person, and hence an increase in their love or their connection with that other actor, right? So it seems as if there's this spectrum of determinism that bumps up against that which is determinable, but that which is determinable moves back against it in terms of possible revisions, and that revisionability is due to information being able to be changed or reconsidered, and that's due to being symbolic. In any case, it appears that both Gary's hard determinism and his claims that he could state everything about his own life, like this is why I became this and this is how I became that, you would find certain that everything that he would state would become a generalization, and that his insistence upon saying it as a fact would be a matter of finding him trustworthy. So Gary takes on a reiterative, self-authorial approach to those who pay attention to him, and his gravity is very strong, and his narrative keeps reclaiming that no matter what, where it doesn't matter what it is we say, there's still, the plane still lands, the man still dies, the world still comes to an end, life is bitter and bleak and mechanical, right? On the other end, information theory almost appears to be acausal, because it appears as if it's still limited to the language that we speak. No matter even what I'm saying, any rebuttal to what I'm saying is a revision or a movement against what it is I'm saying. And of course, that's how we all seem to be interacting on tubes when we run into topics and we try to move to one side or move back to another side. And see, this is also really tricky to talk about, because on the other hand, you won't hear Anton deny cause and effect or speak about acausal processes, right? To speak of information theory as being symbolic enough, or the aspects within a symbol, or the rub of where the language butts up against its limit of description, or what's considered an acceptable paradigm, the accepted paradigm of what the case is. There's an authority that believes the physical science authority of cause and effect still demands determinism, the we didn't start the fire, to constantly continue moving through all of us, and that even the symbolism, even the imaginations that come to mind, even these conceptual bits of information, that you could fall on one side or another, that you could revise in this case and not in another case, that those bits of imagination are cause, that how it is you see images in your mind's eye still is an effect of a cause, that they're there, and that they were put there by the quanta of molecules and atoms and particles of the universe being in whatever situation that they're in, right? But in this case, then I could say that a quanta on one side of the universe, one particle on the other side of the universe, is split, and that the binary is somehow causing this stroke of imagination in my mind, is to say that a cause happened here due to something clear across the universe on a quantum mechanical, as a quantum mechanical argument. And so that might change an incident and a description of an incident, so much so that we can still claim that the authority that's saying what is determinable is the case, even if it's affected by quanta from clear across the universe, even if our decisions, like by the mere fact of the gravity of all the stars and all the particles in the universe affecting us, that whatever our narrative is of cause and effect has to include absolutely everything, if you want to speak of that. And so Gary will say, well, that's exactly where people are smuggling God in, trying to get in miracles, trying to get in a God, right? But at the same time, he appears religious because he's dogmatic to his statements of being certain about what narrative one has to follow in terms of the limit of what is being described as what caused what and what didn't cause what. So that's interesting. That's interesting to talk about and listen to. Yeah. No. So because one could use a paradigm to always include the imagination or information theory to be related, you don't have to do this way, but to relate to quanta or quantum mechanical descriptions of particles and their effect of particles, to include that as a cause and effect, and complete the determinism, one would have to include absolutely everything in the universe as a cause for any incident. Any revisal or any paradigm that's describing cause and effect that's narrowed down has the possibility of revision, but it's also however one carves out whatever description, paradigm, or word structure one wants to narrow the domain down to make a claim about what is determined and what caused what. That cutting it out from the determinism, cutting out the paradigm, like a puzzle piece, is kind of what it means to have free will. We are willing within the domain of the entire universe, narrowing a cause and cutting out a puzzle piece around what it is we believe to be the cause and effect for a particular instance that we're describing. And so the free will is in how do we want to contour the language with the paradigm? How do we want to cut it out? So we still talk about the operatic or the determinable or the apodetic, which is the indeterminable. I think I got that right. And the limit where the plane hits the ground, where the person dies, whatever the limit is, one could always say where we're transitioning from the past to the future is in the now. And at the now, we are always at an indeterminate level. That there's determinism that's pushing everything around, but in order to subscribe to that determinism, you have to include as a cause absolutely everything in the universe on a quantum level for a quantum argument. And that's the stochastic. The stochastic is the indeterminate, and that's constantly going on at the moment of presence. But as you more practically describe events, you still have a narrative paradigm that you're using to defend whatever it is you're claiming is the cause and is the effect of any particular event. And that's often revised, and that the words used to that actually rub up against the previous words used to describe the same event. So you have different stories and different narratives describing the same event. Certain what to say other than, "Bless you, my children."